Thanks everybody for joining today's Test Studio Instructor-led Training. My name is Andy Wheeland. I'll be conducting the training today. We've got lots to cover. This is a pretty long session, but lots of information to cover. In fact, probably more than can fit in 4 hours. We'll also take a break, 15-minute break halfway through at the 2-hour mark as well. Introductions, my name is Andy Wheeland. I'm a sales engineer senior and enterprise solutions consultant with Telerik, and have been working with Test Studio since 2012, so 5 years. And I'm also a certified Scrum Master and do lots of consulting with companies on their agile practices and test methodologies and so forth. Over the next 4 hours, we're going to be going through and starting with some of the basics of Test Studio, getting started with your projects and project settings, analyzing your applications, identifying trends, getting started with those first few tests, and making tweaks to the project settings as you go. And you'll see that tuning of the application is really what helps bring out the ease of use. And we'll talk about verifications, timing. We'll do some troubleshooting. You'll see lots of that. Talk about the element maintenance and so forth. We really focus a lot on the maintenance here because we've built the tooling for you. I mean, any testing framework worth of salt can capture actions and allow you to maybe replay those. But it's when the application changes, it's when things break, that's where your testing tool it starts to either accelerate your abilities or slow you down. And that's really where we've seen the biggest benefit with Test Studio in the past, is that our customers who have adopted this approach have seen some very big returns on their investment. So we'll take that approach too. We'll talk about how in the second half, really more of the coding and code samples. I've got lots of really nice code samples that I can take you through that I've been working on lately. Data-driven stuff, passing variables. We'll get into some really cool stuff at the in the back end of the section. Okay, so again, we'll start from the top here, starting out with the basics, getting through the maintenance kind of portion of things, and then we'll start to get a little bit more complex into the end of the first half there. I do want to spend a few minutes going through some slides, and these may be something that you've seen previously. If you've looked at any of our demonstrations of late from our sales team, you may have seen some of these things. So, but I want to give you a quick view of what we call the Test Studio difference. I'm not going to go through all of these slides, but where a lot of people are hoping to get to is result files being sent via email automatically on a schedule or on a build server process, and then basically looking through failure data. So essentially you set up your test, you set up your list, you set those lists to run, and then you can basically wake up and view the result email data, drill down on results, focus on failures instead of wasting time on stuff that's working, right? That's the catch-22 of the QA. Also, of course, part of this is promoting feedback, creating a feedback loop with the development team and the application owners. And basically with our bug tracking integration, the QA's job is very easy so that you can actually review failure data that's captured for you. So if you're comparing this to a manual process, you'd have to capture quite a bit of data manually, image files of expected and failed state, steps to reproduce the issue, all that stuff. It can be pretty cumbersome, but we do that automatically. We capture all that failure data directly from our record playback capabilities, and allows you to really evaluate if it's something you can fix yourself or something you need help with. You can then either submit it to a bug tracking system like Jira or TFS or TeamPulse, or you could resolve the issue. If it's a test issue, we give you a resolve option to resolve it there. Or if it's something you need our help with, a support issue, you can hit the export button, which zips it up, and attach it to support ticket. I literally did this 10 minutes before our session, where on a test I'm working on, I need some help from our support team. So I took my failure details, I hit export, I zipped it, I went opened a support ticket, and I attached that failure details in. And I attached the test in this case too, so that they can see what my test steps are in my support ticket. But that's really you know, when you realize you have that support system, engineer level support, and you need our help on something, we're here for you, right? You're not just stuck on forums trying to figure it out for yourself. You have access to support. It's one of the reasons people love this application. Now there are in some educational institutions, sometimes there are license agreements where there may be a class set, I'm using air quotes, a class set of licenses that don't offer the support, where the professor quote-unquote license would have support, and that's something that we do sometimes for EDUs, where they may be using Test Studio to actually teach some of the QA process within the classroom, and all the students don't get the support the teacher would in that case. So there are some options with regards to that. But ultimately, we're creating the feedback loop, we're empowering the QA team, we're making it easier to focus on what's failing instead of on wasting our time. And I'm not going to kill you with PowerPoint, but there's a couple things here. This is really an important one, which is to have the 4 solutions to every problem. You know, keep in your mind that there are 4 ways to do everything in Test Studio. When you're creating a test, when you're maintaining tests, and I've got some great examples today of some of the stuff that I'm working on with a project, and you know, why I made decisions the way I did and some things like that. So we'll go through some of that as well. But you have point and click, very easy to use, hit record, do what a user does. You know, I have this after configure project settings, we'll talk about that. But basically the first few tests, you tighten up your settings, you make settings and adjustments to your project, and that makes it very easy to just do point and click recording for record and playback. If that doesn't work, we have a toolbar, a very sophisticated set of tools here that let you do some more advanced capabilities, still codelessly. So these first 2 options are codeless option. The third option, you can get into XY coordinates or location interactions, and still there's a codeless option there. There's a lot of tools that live in this space all the time. They don't really have any other option. We do. And then if we can't do it through any of those means, we'll do it through code in C# or VB.NET. Okay, so that's your kind of approach, and that's really what we find to be the most beneficial to your process and your pocket, is to eliminate or reduce code as much as possible. We can create a codeless test, and we give you a set of tools that allow you to keep that, for the most part, codeless and can be maintained that way by more non-technical users than necessarily have developers do all of that maintenance. So that way the development team can focus on new features and new functionality, and the QA team has more ability to be a participant, an active participant in the application's health and life cycle, and really creates a nice symbiotic relationship. Quick splash on reusability. There's a theme throughout. I'll point this out as we go along too, but we're reusing elements. We're running the same test across 5 browsers. We're running the same test across different deployment environments. We're using repetitive option tests like test to step, like things like logging in, logging out, or some sub-tests, if you will. And you can run your tests as performance and load tests. Also, we do have the last hour pretty jam-packed of the session with performance, load, and mobile. But please feel free to speak up if there's any of those performance, load, or mobile testing that you know, you guys would like to see more or less of. Let me know. And then the last thing I'm going to hit on here is the sophisticated, flexible, fine logic. This is really the heart and soul of what Test Studio does and why it works so well, which is to locate elements not by a position on a screen, but by some other method that is much more reliable, that can stand the test of time. These tests can usually gain lots of mileage over time and create reliability, dependability. Those tests can be used in many different ways, and ultimately when those tests break or an element changes or something fails, it's easy to adapt and evolve and fix the test rather than having to throw something away and start over. And a lot of that has to do with the framework under the hood of Test Studio, which uses this identification strategy that lets you completely custom tailor this to fit your application under test. So if you are lucky enough to have automation IDs, you can put that at the top of your list. If not, you might use some type of unique identifier, or You can find elements by their labels. Text content is basically what a user does. They're looking around at the label on the button and they're finding the button that way. And that way these elements can move. We can have responsive design applications. We can find the same element consistently across multiple browsers because we're not using browser-specific properties. So this really adds to all of that reusability and the ease of use ultimately coming from this. We'll spend a lot of time in this, but this shows you just in the background a single element, how it's identified. In the foreground, the settings that you might tweak that actually change the priority in the way that these elements are captured. Okay? But what we'll start with is just the ease of use approach. We're going to start with the first solution. I'll refer back to this. We'll start with solution 1, which is point and click recorder. Before we do start into recording, though, I'll take you through some settings and things here. And basically, this is a project that I've been working on, and we're going to jump through a couple different projects here. In fact, we'll start over in one of my other projects, this TFS project. And your projects can be attached to source control, TFS, or Git. We integrate to both out of the box. It just so happens that this TFS project that I'm opening is actually currently stored at Git. I moved it from TFS to Git. So it's kind of a little bit of irony there. But you can integrate to either one of those. You'll also have the ability to check in, check out, pull, push, commit, comment, all of those things. You can see too an indicator where a check mark indicates that the test has changed, but that has not yet been submitted, so we can commit that change to Git, as you can see in the source control options here. Same thing for TFS, you'd have the same options over there. And we can also do that at a project level, a folder level, a test level. We can commit all the changes here to Git, for instance. And as you can see, there's a bunch of different changes in this particular subset. So I'll put in a comment there, and all the statuses should change for the tests in question. And you can see the check marks here are going to change over to locks as those things are committed and checked in. All right, so that's the project panel, and as you can see, there's some integrations there at the project level to the source control options. And when you want to get to project settings, you'll need to make sure you click on the project tab. In fact, if I have a test open here real quick, and I click into that test area, you see that the the toolbar on top is now for the test itself. This is sort of a test settings toolbar and debugging options and things like that. When I click on something in the project panel, it brings back my project level toolbar up on top. So if you're ever looking for project settings or the integration points to bug tracking tools and how you set that up, that is here. You'll also find that we've tried to sprinkle the documentation throughout to help you too. So as you can see, there's a link, for instance, directly from this window to the bug tracking configuration. That is opening up on my other window, but it's taking me right to our documentation on that. And also you've got not just Jira, TeamPulse, and TFS, but a custom custom plugin option here as well. And if you do have something that's not in our list, I would check the forums too. You might have another customer of ours that has created a plugin for you and shared that, or you could build one yourself. And I encourage you, of course, to share that with the community if you do. Okay. So that's the projects panel, a little bit about the settings up on top. Also, we have our scheduling integration. We can connect up to a scheduling server. That allows us to have visibility to multiple execution servers. And here you can see I've got 3 different servers that are currently alive and waiting. This would also show me if they're ready, or if they're currently running tests right now. We can drill into these further and see the consumption of RAM and CPU usage and stuff like that. And also if the profiler is running, that would be something we would expect to run if we're doing performance or potentially load testing as well. So lots of great visibility into my runtime lab. And that might look a lot of different ways. Here's an example of a runtime lab. You may configure these in many different ways, and it's flexible enough even to change from something like this to something like this in just a few minutes of redirecting things. But there's some examples in here of some common runtime labs. This is very similar to what I have currently. But that gives you that option to distribute the scheduling capabilities. We do have MongoDB. I know my diagram said SQL, but that is the older thing. I need to update my diagrams. But it does utilize MongoDB. It is automatically installed for you if that's not already on your machine. And then you can enable your storage and your scheduling services to appropriately. And then that's going to come up for us from test lists. We'll be able to schedule test lists across those machines, but that's where you can see status and connectivity of those machines. We also can bring in data sources. This is where you'll bring data sources into the project level. Those could be flat file data sources, which we will copy into a data folder that lives inside of the project folder, and will also be exposed under manage. So after you add these files, you'll find them under manage, but you can also add a database file. And I've got a couple of these database files here as well. Basically the database source here uses a connect string, and the other ones have copies that are stored in the data folder for this particular thing. This also allows you to check in and commit these to source control as well. As you can see up at the top there, you can make sure that everything is checked in appropriately. So there's your data sources. Those could then be bound to test. We'll get to that later, but those can be bound to test for data driving things. And then you've got some compile and cut and copy and paste and other tools up here. Our element repository down here at the bottom. Now these panels, by the way, you can pop out and you can move around, customize the way they are laid out. There are some presets up here too for you to preset. You know, if I do high productivity, for example, it'll pop all the panels into spot there. You can also pin them back. I have my Team Pulse panel pinned back. You can pop them out too if you want to, undock them. So you really can control your environment. I'm constantly moving these around. You'll see me today just move these panels around, close them, pin them back, get them out of the way when I don't need them. Okay, you did see briefly that output panel has a source control, a compiler, and a syntax errors area. You can see that there was an operation failure on my check-in, it looks like. Cool. Probably not linked up to that server that it's hosting it. Okay, then we've got our step builder panel and our properties panel. Properties down here, this is going to show us whatever properties for whatever we're focused on. Just so happens this particular test that we're looking at has some particular properties. Owner, priority, you can set that to whatever you'd like. So these are some fields you can fill out with custom data. You have some custom property fields too. I've actually used one to indicate what bug is associated to a particular test. That actually plays out well later when I get into test lists, because that can be used to help me build test lists. But you can also see whatever you're focused on here. If we focus on an element, we'll see the properties for the element. If we're focused on a test step, we'll see the properties for the test step. So whatever it is you're looking at, this properties panel will show you all the different properties associated to that. And then last but not least, up here on top right is our step builder. There are lots of goodies in here, pre-built stuff, like common section has test to step. This is one of our most popular functions. It's kind of buried here, but it is here for you to be able to kind of use to call tests from other tests. You can code from scratch in here. You can clear browser cache. There's just lots of stuff that's kind of pre-built. There's conditional logic options in here to drop in while loops and if-elses and loops. Dialogues, we should naturally be capturing these, but if you need to, you can drop these into your test. Of course, verifications and actions to, mouse actions, scroll actions, JavaScript events that you can fire on elements. And you'll see this repeated. This is just in the step builder. You'll see a lot of these same things repeated in the element highlighter menu too. So the last panel here is the test panel. I've opened up a test. It's in a tab. If we open up another test, it will tab out for us. We can have multiple tests open, and I'm sure at some point I'll look up and have 30 different tests open up here. You can also do a little bit of a split screen mode here if you want to. You could even share two tests on the same panel there, which is kind of nice when you're kind of working on some subtests and things like that. Or if you're working in code, you might have your code panel over here and your uncode panel over there, if you will. But we can put that back where it was. So we tab those out. You know, again, when you click on the test step, you get your test step toolbar up on top. There are some debugger options we're going to be working through, some steps, some settings here at the test level that you can work through as well. And also you've got local data. This will be used when we want to set up a data source inside of the test rather than using the project level data source we talked about earlier. And then we also have our switch to storyboard option, which shows us all the screenshots that are actually captured during the recording process. These become our expected state screenshots, which we'll see here in a bit too. So what we'll start out with is actually we're going to rebuild this test that we're looking at right now. So we'll just start up a brand new test to begin with. And one more thing I almost forgot before we get into starting tests, we do need to spend a few minutes just in the settings here, because there's a couple settings that I typically will try to make adjustments to prior to even hitting record for the first time. These settings too, I will offer a link for you to some video tutorials. As I mentioned, I'm recording this session, so we'll go through some of these key settings, but also I want you to have all of the stuff that you need to get off the ground and running. So give me 1 minute here. We're going to pull up that settings tutorial for you, because this is a very useful video. There is a bit of UI difference between when this was recorded and what it is today. I'm going to drop this in the chat window for anybody that wants it. And again, sorry for there being a bit of a difference, a couple differences in the UI, but all the settings are still relative. One of the examples, I think this was called identification logic before, now it's called find logic, but some minor changes, minor differences, but all the settings are still very legitimate and should be helpful for you. So check out that video. In addition, we'll go through a couple of these. So recording at the first part of this, first of all, there's some time savers here. This base URL is the environment that you're recording against. So let's say you've got a local instance of your application under test, and you're going to create 300 tests against that local instance. Well, you don't want to necessarily be stuck with tests that only work on one instance, right, on a local environment. You want to create tests that can be easily then be pointed at a staging or even a production environment, so you get a lot more mileage out of your tests. And that's where base URL comes in. Base URL, forgive me, it looks like the screen may have paused a bit there, but base URL is gonna, in the settings here for the project level, is what you're specifying ahead of time to tell Test Studio to look out for that URL. When it sees that URL, it will automatically segment it into a base portion and a navigate portion. So you'll see some of that once we jump into the test step level. But this is just basically telling Test Studio ahead of time, what environment am I recording against? And here, by the way, there's another link directly to the documentation all about this stuff. So it talks about the recording, it talks about base URL, the compare mode, which I'm going to cover next. There's a good story here about all that. The main takeaway on compare mode is I would tell you to set it to full path as a main default. By the way, there's a secondary base URL specific article in here that I like to point out if you want to run stuff against multiple environments, and you'll see that this setting propagates throughout not just the project level, but at the test level, and then ultimately at the list level. So what does that mean? Well, it means you can set it here, you can hit record. When Test Studio sees it and recognizes it, it will know what to do with it. You build out all your tests, you put them in a list, and in the list you can go in and modify the base URL for the entire list. So you're effectively saying everything that I just recorded on localhost is now going to be able to go run on staging or something like that. Okay, compare mode. As I just mentioned, and you go through this in more detail in the video that I've added to the chat window, this is defaulted to full path and query. Why is that an issue? Well, that's explained for you pretty well in the documentation that is right here. But basically, if we are navigating to if we have a dynamic URL, now this isn't really a dynamic URL. It has a query string, but it's not a real dynamic query string. In this case, it's going to Google Translate and it's specifying a language within that string, right? Or in this case, maybe the we've got a language and we've got a segment, I guess, to further go into from Google Translate, I guess. So there are different portions of the URL, and the compare mode is all about how Test Studio recognizes the URL that you record against versus the URL that you execute against. The main point of this whole thing is using full path means you only look at this much of the URL. You don't really care what happens after the question mark. And that's not to say that that's not important or present. It can still be present. What we're doing is a partial recognition, and sometimes it's better to just go more generic. So full path out of the box is the most typical setting, even though our default is full path and query. So this is something I would tell you to change before you hit record. Now, if you have already started to record some stuff and you've started to see duplicated pages and duplicated elements, then you may need to merge page notes, and that is another article here that I'll give you. This helps you clean things up, and it works for pages, it works for frames, it works for elements as well, but basically it's a matter of going in and taking full path and query in many cases and changing it to full path. So save yourself that headache. Here's what it would look like when you see the problem, and here's what it looks like after you merge it. But save yourself the headache, set it ahead of time in the project settings as full path. That's my advice. And then you don't have to do that mess after the fact. Okay? Full path, base URL, and title are the most common. The rest of these I would consider advanced and go to that documentation for more details. Next up, drop-down recording option. The reason I point this out is it is defaulted out of the box to by value. It's another head scratcher as to why that's the default. But by value, the reason that's an issue is because it's not always used. If we have a list of colors, it might be, the text of those colors might be red, green, and blue. Well, the value of those colors might be hexadecimal or might be numeric. They may not make as much sense as, say, the text of the list item. And you have an option here to find the selected drop-down options that are recorded. You can record it as an index, which is a position option, a value, which will go find wherever it is in the list, or a text, which will go find it wherever it is. So the value in the text, I call those followers, because wherever it exists, if it's a hexadecimal, every time it goes to that list, it will look for the same hexadecimal, no matter what order it's in the list. If it's text, it will look for that same text every time in the list, no matter what order it is. If it's by index, it's simply going to a spot and picking that spot. So be careful on that. If you need something specific out of the list, be specific with text or value. If you just want to pick the first item in the list or the second item or whatever, then you would use by index. My default is by text. I typically resort to doing what users do where possible, and this is a case where they're using text, so why wouldn't I? Plus, it tends to be a lot more reliable than the value option. Next up, simulating real clicks and real typing by default. These are project level settings, but they're also test level settings. And actually, so is the drop-down recording option. That's a step level setting. And these click options are test step level settings too. So a lot of these are stuff that you're going to, as we first go through our first few tests, analyzing the application, we're learning how the application behaves, we're learning some trends about the application, and we're making adjustments to these settings. Now, whether or not I turn on these simulate real clicks by default and simulate real typing by default are usually something I determine while I'm analyzing the application. What does it do? What does it mean? Basically, what Test Studio does by default is it does DOM injection. And what that looks like is, for example, on this field, it essentially is like taking an entire string and pasting it into the field. So during execution, it looks just like somebody pasting it into the field as a one long string. And that's fine. That works a lot of times, and it's very efficient. We're doing DOM injection that way. But it's not always effective. You can get false positives sometimes where it does inject the data, but it doesn't trigger a JavaScript handler. And you'll see an example in our first test here of this, where we'll go in and simulate real typing to resolve that problem. Now, if I start to see a trend, if I do that at the test step level, that's great. Maybe I have just a couple test steps that require it. I'll do it at the step level. But if I start to see a trend where this application is requiring it for more and more steps, that's where I would promote it to the project settings level. I would enable it at this level. Now, this is an important caveat here that applies to all of this. These settings that I'm changing do not change anything that's previously been recorded. So when you change compare mode here, when you add a base URL here, when you turn these on, it's not changing anything that you've previously recorded, and that's by design. You want to be able to segment those things out and make changes and evolve things as you go. So that means you may want to re-record something. At the point that you save your settings and hit record, it will apply those new settings. You may want to re-record certain things after you make changes to those settings, and that's why I usually go directly into my project settings first before I ever hit record. I get my things set. I do keep these off until I need them, just to minimize that necessity there. Simulating real types and real clicking require a little bit higher permission, and they also take a little bit more time. So we do try to keep them off where possible. All right, we'll skip browser calibration and stuff for now, and I'm going to jump into Fine Logic. I talked a little bit about this in the slides at the beginning. This is where you customize your Fine Logic strategy, and this is not what yours will look like out of the box, but this might be a good spot to take a screenshot. This is the logic I use. This is the logic I prefer. It's generally speaking works well for me across most applications that I encounter, and I have so many different applications that I test on a daily basis that I encounter, all sorts of different customer applications. Generally speaking, IDs are prominent throughout most applications, but beware, sometimes they're dynamic. If there's dynamic IDs in my application and this is not reliable, I want to lower the priority below something that is more reliable. So if there's a name property that's static, then I'll go to the name property first before I try to use a dynamic property. Okay? So this is structuring, this is telling Test Studio basically that when you hit record, you click a button to first look for this. If that's not there, then look for that. If that's not there, then look for this, and continue to work down the list. My strategy, and this is up to you on your opinion. By the way, Automation ID is the hope, where the development team starts to build the application with test automation in mind, and they actually use automation IDs where possible. We can't always get automation IDs. They should be static and reliable IDs, but that's great. So my strategy is find those automation IDs if they're available. If they're not, try to find a unique ID of some kind or a unique property that's static of some kind. And if I can't do that, then I oftentimes look for the text content, the label on the button. By the way, this says locked. That doesn't mean you can't change its priority. That just means you can't delete it. Okay. You can also, of course, add to this list, and one of the things I added to my list is inner text. I would encourage you to do the same. It's a very valuable way to identify rows within grids, especially when you get into dynamic situations. So I'll show you some of that later on here. All right, looks like we got to get hopping into some of these tests, but this is basically our goal. We want to, in the first few tests, figure out what's the strategy that we need to use here and what's the recording settings that we need to use here. When we've dialed those two main things in, we start to see a lot of ease of use coming out of Test Studio at that point. Okay? So don't be discouraged. Your first few tests are your hardest. Things should get easier and easier as you go. All right. So now let's get a test going. We'll add a new test. I'm just going to jump over web test 3 there because we're pretty much just going to recreate what I have up on the screen, which is to show you one of the most basic tests. You may have seen this before, but it's a good one to show, and it's a very basic idea of the login process. Okay, and it's a foundational building block because a lot of our tests require A, log in, and B, go do something else. And the login process is where there's a lot of times a lot of security mechanisms that don't want machines to be logging in, right? So sometimes we have to be very careful about login processes. Sometimes we're encrypting data in login process. Sometimes there's more JavaScript handlers there than there are in maybe the rest of the application. It's a critical point. If we can't get logged in, then we can't really do much, right? So this is usually where people are trying to learn Test Studio and at the same time trying to go through one of the hardest tests, which you really have to get over in order to get to the next phase, which is the exciting part where things get even easier. So I'm going to start this up. I've right-clicked. I'm going to hit record. A number of ways you can do this. You can open it up in a tab. You can hit record, whichever you want to do. But once I do that, I'll be prompted to provide a URL or and pick a browser to record it. So I'm going to use one of the ones I already have up here. And I'm going to start in IE. And we're going to do some recording in the other browsers too, but I'll tell you ahead of time, I typically try to do most of my recording in IE unless it's an application that works better in Chrome or Firefox. I actually have one I'm working on right now that doesn't work in IE really well at all, so I'm using Firefox for that. You can do a lot of the same things, really all the same things that I'll show you in IE you can do in Firefox and Chrome. There's just one thing in IE that makes it a little bit easier when you're getting into verifications and stuff, and I'll show you what that is. So we'll start with that, but we'll mix it up. The point is you can mix and match. You don't have to have all your steps recorded from the same browser. These are highly editable tests. You can jump into the middle and add and customize. So don't feel like what you're doing is set in stone, and don't feel like that if you mess something up that you have to throw it away and start over. There's very few times where we actually have to throw things away and start over. So now we are in an open browser. So IE browser has opened up. It navigated to the application. It captured my navigate step for me. It's attached the recorder, and we're in live record mode. Okay, so very easy to hit record, provide a URL, and choose a browser, and you're in a live record mode, right? You're off and running. Now, if I had provided the base URL in my project settings, let's say this portion of the URL, this is the base portion of the URL, if I had provided that in the settings of the project level already, once I navigated to this site, it would have automatically done this for me. I'm doing it manually right now, but it would have automatically segmented the base portion into the base setting there, and that's what sets you up later on to swap that out either at a test level or at a list level, and then it's appended by the /welcome navigate path, right? So server address /page, you can easily swap out that server address at that point. You can also, if you've got URLs that are more advanced than that, you can actually data drive the URLs in different ways with the navigate portion, the base portion, or decoded URL. But that's if it's not already satisfied by the base portion alone. But that's what it would look like just /welcome if it recognized that base URL. But we'll go ahead and redo that. There we go. So it captured that for us. We're in a live record mode, and the first solution is do what a user does. Hit record and do what a user does. So we'll go click login. Captures that. Click login step. We'll type in a username. We'll tab to the next one. We'll do password. Of course, a couple best practices. You don't want to do any autocompletes while you're creating tests. You want to make sure you're typing everything in. If you're doing an autocomplete and you're building this test in IE, that same autocomplete might not be available in Chrome or Firefox or Safari or Edge. So, it's good to, at the point that you're creating a test, you're kind of putting on a different set of glasses, and you're doing things in a slightly different way to capture those full functions. That also plays out with things like tab keys. As a general user, we would probably just tab from field to field. But when you're recording a test, tabbing from field to field, well, at least Test Studio, is not necessary. Where in some applications, test applications, I call it a cheat. They cheat by tabbing from field to field. And that's subject to error because tab indexes can change very easily. You don't really have sophistication on that. Basically this is just a keyboard operation, and it doesn't really know what it's doing. It knows it's going to hit the tab key on the username text field, but has no idea where it's going. Whereas this step with the password here knows it's going to the password field, and when it finds it, it's going to pop in that value. Okay, so this means tab keys, keyboard operations, they're usually not needed. You can disable them, you can delete them. If you don't know whether you need it or not, disable it, run the test without it. If you know you don't need it, delete it. And you can edit this while you're recording. If you make mistakes, if you're over here and you click around and you accidentally grab some steps that you don't need, pay attention to that. I mean, this is also best served on a dual monitor. I'm showing you everything crammed on one screen. But when I'm doing my normal work, I've got a browser on one screen, full screen for that application under test, and I've got Test Studio on the other screen, and I can work between those very, very easily. Okay, so you're getting a little bit of injustice with this real estate of sharing both on top of each other here. But yeah, if you're clicking around and it's capturing stuff, pay attention to that. You can easily go grab that and say, oops, I didn't mean to do that. Let me go ahead and just delete those. Okay, so it's very easy to keep your tests clean and to record and play back and edit all in the same time, basically. So one more thing before we go on. So far we've just done what a user does. We've hit record. Actually, let's go ahead and we'll finish out that idea. We'll go ahead and finish out like a user here. We'll just click login, and you can see we are logged in. And I'm just going to exit this browser, close that browser. That ends the recording. Oops, looks like I have two recording browsers. That's a no-no. Another best practice, I have 3 recording browsers. Probably not the best use of resources to have a bunch of recorders left open. I'm not, do as I say, not as I do in this case. As you can see, you can have multiple recorders open simultaneously. Okay, so now we've got that test. Navigate, click login, enter a username and a password, click submit, right? And let me just see if I need to close any more tabs. I think we're good. So we'll just hit execute. This is still sticking with option 1, right? Solution 1. Record, do what a user does, and hit execute, see what happens. We can stick with the same browser, but I'm going to go ahead and mix it up. You'll see that in the execution we have more than one browser. I'm going to go for Firefox on this one. Now for this execution, I have annotation turned on. I'll show you where that can be turned on. But that's where you'll see this red and yellow highlighting. You'll also see at the bottom which steps are being executed and what's happening kind of down there. You can also pause and do some different options during the execution. But it went through the process and everything checks, right? Let me show you first real quick. I'm going to turn off annotation. I'm going to run this without annotation so it'll speed up the test execution. So I just want to show you again this execution. Oh, I hit IE this time. I didn't really mean to. But same test on IE and Firefox. Now on that IE run, you barely saw a blip, right? Everything passed. In the view log, we can see Internet Explorer 11, so we have really the steps to reproduce the issue here in the log file. And tells me the browser and version that we're running against, tells me that it passed all these test steps. Everything looks great, right? And it took almost really barely over 1 second to execute that. Now, what I had on before was annotation. When you turn on annotation and you execute that, I'll keep it on IE, so we have an IE to IE comparison here for a second. Well, now we'll see it slow down, and that's because the annotation, this little button right there, I've enabled that, and it adds 400 milliseconds between test steps. So now we can see the username, the password, the login button, and the window closing, right? Everything's roses. We've got passing tests. Things are great. It's going to be so easy from here, right? Well, if you see it, if you see what's happening, it's basically getting to the point where it clicks submit, but we don't really know if it's succeeding or not. Because a login test, it doesn't really matter what happens after this, or up to this point. It's what happens after this that's important. After we submit, did we get logged in? Did we succeed? So let's go back into the record mode here, and I'm going to use a function we call run to here. And we're going to use IE again in this case. We're going to do run to here on step 3. This will run steps 1 through 3 and then attach the recorder. It's a great way to get back in and edit a test. So clicks login, it types in username, it's passed those test steps, and now it's connecting the recorder. So we're going back to record mode. And now once you're in the live record mode, you can also do run selected steps or run from here as well. So let's go ahead and do run selected step here, just this one step. You can make it a group or a single step, and it populates that password field, right? And we get a green check mark for that. That passed as well. Okay, now I'm going to pause. Oh, my recorder is paused right now. This is something I'm going to come back to in a moment, but now I am going to right-click step 5, and I'm going to do run from here, or run selected step. It's the last step. It doesn't really matter which of those two I choose, but if there were more steps, I might run it out from there. Okay, perfect. So we're logged in. Now, proof, as I mentioned, we didn't have proof in this test whether we succeeded, what happened after we submit. So we could put Scooby-Doo in as username and password, and this test would continue to pass and give us false positives. It's that verification that says, did we succeed? Did we actually get logged in? That gives us that proof. And that comes with the element highlighter. Now, I could have done this in my first test. I wanted to give you a first test of just do what a user does. But as you start using Test Studio, you'll get used to turning on and using the element highlighter as you go. So you're basically putting in verifications along the way. You can always go back and edit very easily and add in verifications later, but I think you'll find that it's very easy, and you'll get the hang of using this tool and adding verifications along the way. Now, I mentioned that I prefer to use IE when I do verifications, and this is the reason why. IE has this great extrapolation of layers. Now Firefox and Chrome will let me highlight and let me do all these same steps here, but it doesn't have this same extrapolation. I'd be able to highlight the cell, and then I could go to locate in DOM, and then down here from the DOM I can go to a row level, right? So I can still do the same things, but in IE it's got this really cool extrapolation for me. And at these different layers you've got different verification options that are there for you. Okay? So lots of great things. Now for this particular test, we just want to verify that we've succeeded at logging in. I don't need to mess with this grid for that. I'm just going to use logout. That usually is a sign that we've logged in successfully, so we'll verify that text contains logout, and now we've got some proof. We'll go ahead and close the browser to end the recording, and let's go run this back in Firefox this time. So now it kicks up Firefox. We still have our annotation turned on, so we're getting that play-by-play. Our login, our username, our password, our click submit, and now our verification. And using the annotations, with the annotations turned on, this is really useful because you can see better step by step what's happening. And you might be realizing that it's not actually logging in, right? Now, when I created this test step, I had to help it to get to that next page so I could create that verification. But during the execution there, it did not make it to that page. Now, the first thing I would suspect in this kind of case is maybe it's a timing issue. We, by default, at the test step or at the test level, are using a 15-second wait on elements timeout with a 500 millisecond check interval. What does that all mean? That means that you have up to 15 seconds to locate the element for each test step. So for this particular test step, we had the logout link, and we had up to 15 seconds to locate that.
This is what I found out for you.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate that. Sorry about that. My phone thought I was talking to it. Not sure what I said. But so this is the logout link. This is the verify the text contains logout link, and that totally threw me off. But basically, it didn't make it to that. We can actually look at the failure details here, double-clicking the red X, and we could see that it couldn't find the element. Oh, I was talking about the timing. So, sorry, before I jump into the failure details, my first suspicion is that maybe it didn't have time. It clicked submit, and then it didn't have time for that page to load because it took more than 15 seconds, then it failed out. And that's what will happen, is by default, this 15 seconds, every half second it'll say, is it there, is it there, is it there? If it's not there, then it fails the test. So a first measure might be to enable the wait on elements timeout. If it's a timing issue, check this checkbox, rerun the test, right? Don't waste your time trying to get fancy yet. Just check that checkbox and rerun the test. That's basically just saying, well, now I'll give it up to 30 seconds to locate that element and then verify the text content of it. And once you enable this option, you also can modify it even further. So if I needed to make that 40 seconds, these are milliseconds of course, I could do that or whatever I need. Okay? So timing is definitely something to keep in mind. I could also change this to a wait step. And under the right-click options here, I could change role set as wait. That would automatically change it to a 30-second timeout as well. You also, in the recording browser, which I'm not in right now, it looks like because I just ran it, but in the recording browser, you have the ability to use wait steps and add wait steps in as well too. So now let's look at the failure details. So if the timing isn't the issue, you know, we might want to look at the data here, and of course you always want to look at the failure details. It's going to tell you a little bit more, but looking at this failure details, my first thought might be, okay, let's think about more time. So we've already kind of covered the more time thing. If that's the case, maybe it just couldn't find it because it didn't have the time. Now, looking at this though, another thing that might be happening is it couldn't find the element. It was looking for it based off of combination of its ID combined with its tag name. Very common type of combination that you'll see Test Studio use. Something unique combined with something more generic. And that is really a very easy way to identify elements cross-browser most of the time. Now the element was found with a backup search, but keep in mind of where your source is coming from. Check your sources here, because basically first of all, what happens when a failure occurs, when it fails to find the element the way you've prescribed, and by you prescribing, I mean you hit record and did what a user does and it automatically captured this for you. But if it can't find it this way, it will kick in the backup search methods, which will then attempt to find it in other ways. Well, the backup methods are typically weaker methods, and the further you go down the list, the weaker and the weaker those methods are. And a lot of times the weak methods can find things, because they're weak. You know, they'll find anything, right? So be wary. XPath is a weaker identifier. It may provide me with some suggestions. We're going to see those suggestions in a little bit. But so this is good news that it did find it with a backup method, but I would like to see a backup method that's stronger than this. Like maybe there's a different ID I didn't know about, or there was a text content or something else there that I could have used before I'd have to stoop to the level of XPath. We have the exception log here. We have the complete test log here. Again, Firefox 5101, failed on step 6, some failure information. That time took 30.5 seconds to run because it was using up the timeouts. It had to look further, and we had annotation turned on, which was adding almost half a second between steps 2. Okay? So of course it took longer than 1 second that time. Now in the failure details we also have images, and this looks like a horrible expected state image. I am not sure why that is the way it is. This should not be this particular image. This is a bad capture. I do have an option to recapture this. Let's give that a go actually. We'll try a little recapture. To recapture images I will switch to the storyboard, and up at the top I have a recapture option. This will now execute the test case and blah blah blah. We'll see if that resolves it because I'd like to get a better image there. This is also really useful if your UI has changed. You want to just recapture the images for the storyboard. That's cool. And we'll just run this back again. I think we were focused on Firefox for now. We'll eventually run this against all of our different browsers. But ultimately, we're getting that failure. If we didn't have the verification at the end, we wouldn't be getting a failure. We'd be getting a false positive. So again, verification is very important. What we're going to do though is since this is not the right screen that it's occurring on, we want to start working our way backwards, right? We can't blame this logic because it's not getting to that spot in the test anyways. But before we go on, I do want to go back to resolve failure to show you where the backup search method and the suggestions come into play. And this is where we got stuck before. So this is where, okay, this is where the element logic is broken and the test needs to be updated. The element itself needs to be updated. So you can do this directly from the failure details. So imagine this. You walk in, it's Monday morning, you actually saw an email on the train on the way in that said that the test list from last night that had 100 tests in it, 90 of them passed and 10 of them failed. And you can even drill down into failure data that's built into your email. We've even added some new formats like HTML and XML in addition to Word and Excel and our own proprietary format. So you get informed, you get information, you know what you're walking into. And then you go into a failure of a test list, you drill down to a failed step, you double-click the failure details, and you go through this data to determine if it's something you can fix or not. When it's a test-related issue, the Resolve Failure tab is here. It will be different data or different options depending on the type of failure. Since it's a failure to find an element, it's presenting me options to fix the broken element. Then, if there are suggestions, which in this case are brought to us by XPath, those suggestions are presented here. So at the point of failure, when this logic failed, and specifically the ID was the culprit that it was not able to locate, it rolled down the list and it continued to try to find it by the name property, by other properties, and then ultimately XPath says, hey, I found something. And XPath came back with what it found. XPath did what XPath is trained to do. It went to a spot in the corner of the screen and it just found what's there. Well, on the pre-login screen, in the same position is the link that says login. On the post-login screen, it's the same position, but it says log out. So what did it find? It found the login link, which just further proves we never got to the right page. What's nice about this, what I like to point out about this, is that a suggestion, even though this came from XPath, can certainly still be helpful. That doesn't mean I'm going to fix this by using XPath. But if there are many cases where I'll see that the very quick fix, a very quick fix can come from suggestions when a failure occurs. Now XPath didn't quite hit the mark this time, but even if XPath is the one that found the option, I'll usually use one of the stronger identifiers that it brought back for me. Okay, equivalent, if I needed the login link, I just use this ID instead of this ID. But ultimately we didn't get to the right page, so we can't blame that. That's where back here we'll do our submit bug, populate the bug data, the description and the name. It attaches the failure details. I got this one ready to fire against TFS, and I submit that over to my team. So for an application issue, boom, I've just informed my development team. I've just created that feedback loop. They now have a bug in TFS. Whoever's responsible for triaging that should be on top of it already. And they have the attachments that are with that include the log files, the image files, the page DOM, all of that data. Okay? So, okay, let's drill into what's going on here. So we have this failure at the end. Let's look at this login button submit. This test step is passing, but it doesn't seem to be doing what it's supposed to do. So let's add a little bit more care. Let's tease out the failure by using more verifications. And a good verification to use in this case may be to make sure the login button is enabled prior to clicking it. Okay, well here's an easy way to do that. We already have a test step that uses the login button, which means we already have the login button in our element repository. By clicking a particular test step, you are also choosing its element, which is really useful when you want to build another step against it, because you just click on the click on the test step, and then in your step builder over here you can go to actions or verifications, and you can easily add some actions against the element that you've highlighted. Okay, so I don't have to go back into a record mode. Now I could very easily go back into record mode and do this verification there. But since I already have a test step that uses it, I'll just click on verifications. We'll double click on enabled, and now I have verify login button submit is enabled. And I can alternatively modify this to is disabled if need be with a toggle there. Now ultimately that's added it after the step 5. I want it before, so I'll drag and drop this to before that. And now we're in the right order. Okay, verify that it's enabled, then click submit. Let's go ahead and rerun this test, see what we end up with. I'm keeping annotations off. We'll just let it get quick so we can catch up on our list of things to do here as well. Boom, it failed, and it failed more quickly, which is perfect. That's getting me closer to the real culprit here. And now, rather than relying on some page after this submit button that we never got to, I have something identified that's on this particular page. This failure details, again, double click the red X. Element enabled state didn't match. It expected it to be true. The actual was false. There's no expected state image for this because we didn't record it. If I did a recapture, it would add it in here. But that's why you might not see an expected state. If you've added a step without recording the step, I just added it from the toolbar or from the step builder, then it doesn't come with a screenshot. All right, you can certainly add it after the fact. But resolve failure in this case different, right? Syntax based, then true or false, pretty easy. But that's if it's the test issue, right? But this is telling us that login button is not enabled, and I'm starting to look at this password field. So I'm working my way backwards. The password field, we saw it populating the variable, the value into that field. But this is something to definitely be suspicious of, especially in login processes, is where there may be JavaScript handlers, and I mentioned this earlier in the settings, and here it is showing up in real life. Basically, when we are using DOM injection and populating this string ABC123 into that field, it's not triggering the JavaScript handler that's there. So very easy fix. We've talked about some easy fixes here. First thing I thought of was add more time to the last verification. Second thing I thought of was add another verification in front of the login button to make sure it's enabled. So I'm tightening up, making a cleaner test out of this. The third option here, let's start looking at the password field and see if maybe this failure is the result of a false positive. When you have a false positive at a step level, it's usually an indicator that there is a JavaScript handler there. And it succeeds at populating the password field. It put the ABC123 into that password field, right? We saw it happen, but it didn't do it the way the application wanted it to. So another simple fix. Try checking the checkbox for simulating real typing. Rerun the test. Right? So far, to maintain and to modify this test, we've done some checkboxes and we've added a couple extra steps pretty quickly and easily. And watch what happens now. The username is plopped in there. I'm going to run that back with annotation this time. But the username is plopped in there as it was previously in one string. But the password field, it takes much more care. So watch it this time slowed down with annotations turned on. Username plop. Password, focus on the field, and then it brings in the mouse click and then the individual characters. That enabled the login button. The login button is clicked. Logout shows up, the verification passes, and now we have our passing test, right? So this is the challenge that you have to get through that first process of logging in. Now that's just one example. It's a pretty common example, and it's to show you where you troubleshoot your way, you add verifications, and of course that worked on Firefox. Let's go run that on I haven't hit Edge too long. I don't know about Edge. Safari here maybe. Run it on Chrome. We'll run it on all these different browsers and make sure that it works. And now we've got this juicy little login test that is able to work across all the browsers that we can start to build from, okay? Now I know we took almost an hour and a half to get through our first test, but again, these are foundational tests. Hopefully I don't have to mess with this login test ever again until the application changes or something breaks, right? And hopefully it's not a test issue. We've gone through all of the different test issues that it could be, so we're good, right?